historical and philosophical context for what ends up happening in biblical theology. During the 16th century, this coincides with the Reformation. You have the rise of humanism. And when I use the term humanism in this historical sense, I'm not talking about secular humanists. I'm talking about a school of thought that is basically rejecting because someone said so and wants to go to the original sources. And so there were people like Erasmus who were Catholic humanists that were not content with some sort of papal interpretation or papal pronouncement. They wanted to go back to the sources, check them out, and at times even uncovered some fraudulent claims made ex cathedra. But now God is moving history to, I think, effect the Reformation, but one of the things that's going on that becomes a necessary part of getting us to the Reformation is the rise of humanism and interest in returning to the sources. And this rise of humanism is going to have an impact on biblical theology as we work its way through history. During the Enlightenment, of course, the Enlightenment is the age of reason. Autonomous reason is reigning supreme, and this is going to work itself out in a philosophy of history that's centered around what comes to be known as logical positivism or historical positivism. Historical positivists argue that there's no essential difference in doing history and doing any other kind of academic or scientific endeavor, doing anything related to human knowledge. And so historians are going to try to develop methods that will place history on a firm scientific basis. How do you do a history of the fall of the Roman Empire? The same way, theoretically, that you would do, trying to figure out germ theory. You get a petri dish. You investigate it with a number of rationalistic presuppositions. A fellow by the name of Leopold von Ranke is a leading figure in this. He argues that history has to be detached, it has to be impartial, it has to be objective. You judge history through the lens of rational, objective thought. Others are going to take up that battle cry, if you will, and are going to argue that there are universal laws that govern social activity just as there are laws that govern the physical universe. And they're discoverable, and you can count on them. So the fellow wearing the white lab coat in the biology lab is roughly equivalent to the fellow wearing the so-called white lab coat investigating history. A fellow by the name of Auguste Comte, he's the father of logical positivism. He argues that human knowledge passes through three levels. The theological, now remember we're in the age of the Enlightenment here, which is going to take us into the age of progress, which is the 19th century, where everything related to human history is just getting better and better and better. The further we go along, the better off all humans are. So anyway, Comte is saying that there's a progress to human knowledge, passes through three levels. The first is theological. We explain changes in the universe, changes in science, changes in human behavior, whatever. We explain them through divine action. And then later on, we move to the metaphysical as we evolve or as we learn more, as we become more enlightened, and that changes are explained by abstract forces. We don't really need God in the gaps, but there's some other force out there that's causing this until finally we get to the scientific level and where everything can be rationally explained. The theological, the metaphysical, and then the scientific. And this is going to have a huge impact on biblical theology. Hopefully I'll be able to connect the dots a little later. And not just, maybe not biblical theology, but just theology in general, the approach to Scripture in general. Because, as we read the Bible, if you're in the 13th century or 12th century, back in that theological era of human knowledge, it was perfectly sane and rational to believe that God caused axe heads to float, and God raised the dead, and Jesus healed lepers with a touch, and all those sorts of things, because God just intervenes in human history, and we really don't need any sort of other explanation. Why is it this way? Because God did it. But then as we evolve, we become less superstitious. We realize that the universe is probably ordered, and there's probably other forces involved, and we're not denying that God exists, but maybe he's not quite as involved as what we thought he was, and what was attributed to God in the past, especially the Bible, can now be attributed to other kinds of forces, until finally, once you get up to the abstract, or I'm sorry, to the scientific level, we can name the law and we can quantify all this stuff. And so how did Jesus feed the 5,000? Well, he probably just encouraged everybody to share. And which, if you think about it, causing, 5,000 people to all simultaneously share their food is probably a better trick than actually multiplying loaves and fishes. And so that's really what was going on there. And, and then maybe you get the swoon theory of the crucifixion and resurrection or something like that. But all of this can be explained through normal phenomena without making any sort of appeal to some sort of miraculous divine action where the laws that govern the universe, perhaps even the laws that God created in a deistic fashion, are circumvented. This is going to have a huge impact on theology, this kind of thinking. Because by the time we get to the age of progress in the 19th century, there's going to be this quest for the historical Jesus that begins. And some of you, well, hopefully all of you read the Gobler article. And so you see the beginnings of this kind of thinking. During the 19th century, we get the first formal quest for the historical Jesus. Most of you are familiar with the Jesus Seminar today, which is a later quest for the historical Jesus, but very much rooted in the same sorts of presuppositions that we find in the original historical quest, or the quest for historical Jesus. When the first quest begins during the 1800s, it's going to presume the relevance and possibility of a scientific approach to the history of the life and teachings of Jesus. And so how are you going to approach this? With all of the pervasive naturalistic presuppositions that we find represented in the more hard scientific disciplines is going to be brought to bear in these historical questions of what did Jesus say and what did Jesus do.
You took inspiration out in the name of being scientific?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's the problem with inspiration in a naturalistic world? It's huge, isn't it, right? You can't account for inspiration. Inspiration is by definition impossible if you approach things with completely naturalistic presuppositions. Because inspiration is a supernatural act. It's a divine thing, right? And so what room is there? I mean, it's a, yeah. So what happens to the whole discipline of biblical theology, at least as I've articulated what we want to call biblical theology in here, if there's no inspiration?
Well, it's kind of an asinine assumption to assume that 66 books written by 40 authors across 15 centuries is going to have one message. Yeah. Now, we, with our evangelical, theological pre-commitments, will say, well, God was the one divine author who does that. But if you dismiss that as being false by definition, then there really is no reason to suppose we could possibly do biblical theology. And that's what's ironic about that whole Gobler article, is he makes a call for some sort of biblical theology. Not, hopefully as you read it, you're able to discern, he's not thinking the exact same thing that we're talking about here, but at least he's using some language. And I appreciate what he's trying to do. Wouldn't approach it the same way.
But what's ironic about it is that call is basically dead on arrival. It just spontaneously aborts because they didn't have the theological presuppositions to carry through on the endeavor. It's a very weird thing in church history that Gabler would make a call for this when he doesn't have the right theological presuppositions to actually accomplish what he's calling for. And so almost immediately in church history, you find during the 19th century, you have this call for biblical theology, and it's the response to the academy is, it's impossible. So all we can do is New Testament theology. All we can do is Old Testament theology. If you walk down in the library and look at all the great Genesis to Revelation biblical theologies written during the 19th century, it will take you like a millisecond to read them. I mean, there's like none, because it's by definition impossible to do biblical theology. Most people, as we'll find, really doubted that there could even be a New Testament theology. They try to make it work. But if you don't believe that God can intervene in human affairs, or if you don't believe that God will actually intervene in human affairs to supernaturally move human authors to write, then why should we believe that we can have any coherence, or maybe not any coherence, but total coherence from Matthew through Revelation, or even Genesis through Deuteronomy? Really, if we think about human nature, why should we think that Paul could even be consistent between 1st and 2nd Corinthians? Why should we believe that Paul could be consistent from 1 Corinthians 1 through 1 Corinthians 16 even? Why? I mean, I've read some of your papers. There's no reason to believe that you have to be consistent in your thinking all the time. Just, I'm kidding. I just made that up. Yeah. No, that's not true of you guys. So I'm not going to say anything about Descartes and Hume and Kant at all. They're kind of road bumps in this surge to biblical theology, or on the road to biblical theology. The historical critical method, though, I do want to make a couple statements about that. And this is just my conclusion on the whole thing. The historical critical method, as practiced during the 19th century and is still practiced by so many today, it seems to me is at its root atheistic. That is, it celebrates the authority of human reason over divine revelation. And hopefully a lot of you can see this as you read Jesus seminar materials. By the way, a little advertisement. At the Northwest Regional ETS, Marcus Borg is going to have a discussion with Darrell Bach. Or is it Bach or Blomberg? It's Craig Blomberg, isn't it? Yeah. So you might want to go listen to that, because you don't get more Jesus seminarish than Marcus Borg. So that should be good. In the historical critical method, it attempts to adjudicate between theological content and some sort of historical human content. And when you reject out of hand any notion of supernaturalism, then it's up to you as the investigator to try to bifurcate or adjudicate what is it that is religious versus what is actually historical. And when you approach it from that way, there's no reason to believe that individual writers, the thoughts of individual writers, can be brought together. And so what you end up with, as I said before, just a series of New Testament theologies. There's no way you can have a unifying theology that can be systematized in any way. And eventually what we'll find in church history, and I'll go through this really fast, is that the whole idea of New Testament theology is rejected in favor of a more anthropological and sociological study of New Testament religion. Okay? And so the New Testament becomes this an historical source book of what people believed in the past. Written with all sorts of stuff in there that includes myth, superstition, these ridiculous beliefs of this backward group of people who believe that God would actually intervene in human history, if God even exists. I mean, it's questionable in my mind whether some of the leading New Testament scholars of the 19th century were even theistic. Whether they even believed in a personal God. They certainly denied that God would interact in human history. It's functionally deistic at best. Not everyone, and I'll walk through a few of them for you.